Thank you, Haya. Esteemed members of the Pacific Health Education Systems, the government and civil society representatives, development partners, distinguished participants in the Pacific and around the globe. Good morning and good afternoon from Papua New Guinea. This will be our third day of the 24th PHES, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Pacific Regional Consultation for the 7th International Conference on Adult Education, or CONFINTE. When we discuss the SDG goal number 4, our education agenda, we are not only talking about our children's education, but adult literacy, basic education, and the realization of lifelong learning, as it is an important integral part of our mandate. Let us remind us again in this conference that progressing adult literacy rates is not the end of adult learning and education. Adult education has long been recognized as a critical factor in addressing environmental and sustainability issues, ensuring human rights, citizenship, cultural heritage, and well-being, as well as contribution to the economic development of our respective countries and regions. So the same principle of leaving no one behind for children applies to the consideration for adult learning and education. We need to better understand and overcome the barriers to education faced by those living in especially rural and remote communities, people with disabilities, illiterate adults, out-of-school youth, and minorities, for both men and women. Just as in education for children, we need to sharpen our policies and governance of adult learning and education. Equitable access and participation in adult learning and education, and assuring quality through formal and non-formal and informal opportunities is critical. Adult learning and education has been facing a long history of assessment, monitoring, and evaluation, the resource mobilization challenges as well. I want to extend my great appreciation for your participation in this important consultation today. And I wish you all the best with the discussions on adult education or adult learning and education. So without any further delay, it is now my great pleasure to invite Mr. Kanchi Osia, the Commissioner for the Republic of Marshall Islands, Minister of Education, Sports and Training, to moderate the first session of the day. May I also ask each moderator and presenters for the sessions today, the 3 sessions, to respect the time allocations we have allocated for your sessions today. Thank you, Mr. Osia. The floor is now yours. Aya, the floor is now Mr. Osia to moderate this session.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. I do not see Mr. Kanchi. May we start from the opening remarks by UIL Director?
Okay, we will connect with Mr. Osia shortly, hopefully. So let us now proceed to ask Dr. David Charina, PhD Director, UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, to make its opening remarks.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to this consultation organized in preparation for the 7th International Conference on Adult Education, CONFINTEA 7, which will be held in Morocco in 2022. With today's meeting, we wish to generate contributions on the thematic debates that will take place at the conference and identify challenges and opportunities to promote adult education and lifelong learning in the Pacific sub-region. This consultation concludes the series of sub-regional consultations in Asia and the Pacific, which were organized by the UNESCO Bangkok office in cooperation with the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning and UNESCO field offices earlier this year. CONFINTEA 7 will examine adult learning and education as a key component of lifelong learning for sustainable development. Today's consultation takes place against the background of the economic and environmental realities of the sub-region, which includes 16 countries and 1 territory, snapping several time zones, which are enormously diverse in terms of size, number of inhabitants, level of economic development, and other criteria, ranging from a few OECD member countries to a large number of small island developing states. While challenges might look at times not that different, specifically in relation to climate change, solutions need to be tailor-made, taking into account countries' specific context. Target 4.6 of Sustainable Development Goal 4 stipulates, and I quote, "By 2030, ensure that all youth and a substantial proportion of adults, both men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy." This is a very important target to attain the Sustainable Development Goals in their entirety. However, many countries face tremendous challenges to ensure that all youth and adults acquire not only the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but further skills and competences necessary to be an active player in the economy and in society at large. As the lead UN agency for SDG 4, UNESCO supports countries in designing appropriate adult and lifelong learning policies and programs. It also offers spaces for policy sharing and peer learning. CONFINTEA 7 is expected to develop a new framework for action on adult learning and education that will replace the Belém Framework for Action adopted at CONFINTEA 6 in 2009 in Brazil. Results of this online consultation will contribute to shape this new framework for action that will be adopted by member states at CONFINTEA 7 next year. Since last year, the world has been facing a major challenge as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected many facets of our lives, in particular education. Schools were closed for extended periods, and past improvements in enrollment and quality have been compromised. This setback also heavily affected adult education and learning. This consultation provides a unique opportunity to review the state of adult learning and education in the sub-region, identify key challenges, and articulate priority areas that need to be considered at global level during CONFINTEA 7 and eventually reflected in a new framework for action. So I thank you very much for your participation in this very important event, and I wish you successful deliberations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. Ayad, do we have the moderator on?
Thank you, Dr. Combra. He may not be still on. May I suggest if any other PHES member is willing to, if not, I understand the Professor Sandy Morrison could also take place as well.
A friend from Marshall Islands cannot be connected online, so we will proceed with the next presentation, and we should by then identify one of our colleagues to be the moderator. But for now, without any further delay, I'd like to ask Aya, the Education Program Specialist in UNESCO office for the Pacific States, to present the introduction on global preparation for Conferencia number 7. Aya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Combra. My name is Aya Aoki. I'm Education Program Specialist at the UNESCO Office for the Pacific States. I'm sharing this presentation today on behalf of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, as well as our office. Conferencia is an international platform on youth and adult learning. Since 1946, 6 of such international conferences have been organized by UNESCO. The last one was held in Belém, Brazil in 2009. The key participants are Ministry of Education, responsible for promoting adult learning and education, representatives of civil society from member states who are important links to ALA practice, various UN organizations, and international organizations. Member states are asked to form a delegation that represent the full variety of ALA policy and practice in their countries and related approaches in ALE in Conferencia 7 next year. The private and corporate sectors and media are invited to Conferencia and will play a very important role in promoting awareness on ALA. Here's a chronological overview of the entire Conferencia process since the last meeting on Conferencia 6 to the upcoming meeting next year. I would like to highlight that the Conferencia 6 in 2009, we have had adopted the Belém framework for adult learning and education in 2009 that serves as the key policy framework with its definition of 5 key areas of actions. And member states are committed to take action with regard to policy, governance, finance, participation, inclusion and equity, and quality of ALE. In 2015, UNESCO member states also adopted the recommendations on ALE with its 3 fields of learning, which are literacy and basic skills, professional development, and vocational skills, and active citizenship skills. Every 3 years, GREL, or Global Report on Adult Learning and Education, is put together by UIL for monitoring and learning, with the last report focused on citizenship education. Next, The National Commission of UNESCO and UNESCO regional cluster offices facilitate national level preparation. This sub-regional consultation for the Pacific is the last one in Asia, followed by the overall Asia-Pacific regional consultation planned in September. These consultations will inform the international community on all relevant developments in the field of ALE. Advisory committee consisting of these members inform international community on ALE. Next, please. In 2021, there are a series of regional international consultations in all of the 5 regions. We are confident that the 5 regional consultations will bring together 5 relevant outcomes recommendations that mirror developments and specific relevant aspects from the regional perspective to feed into global conference in Morocco next year. Next slide, please. The sub-regional and regional consultations are especially important to look at the key themes that are relevant for all the regions from the overall perspective. These topics are: ALA is a key component of lifelong learning and is central to ALE. This is also a key component for the Education 2030 framework and principle of leaving no one behind. Without ALE, health, wellness, economic development, and children's education all cannot be achieved. The conference will also have a close look at the impact of COVID-19 and how far ALE plays a role in to overcome this crisis, and also how far the crisis has impacted education overall, and especially ALE. We will have a look at the role and potential of ICT in ALE and what role ICTs had and can play to mitigate the COVID-19 crisis and how they can help in the future. ALE as a driver of social cohesion will be discussed to reduce inequality and social mobility, structure, employment, access to information and knowledge. New partnership for development, especially with private and corporate sectors, will play a role to further development of ALE. So these are the principal framing topics that will play a key role in discussing ALE at Confintia 7 globally. Through our consultation today, we can also suggest issues, concerns, challenges, and topics that are actually relevant to our region. Thank you.
Thank you, Aya, for the information and the suggestions you have made in your presentation. We should take note of what you're proposing in the, and I have questions. If we have any questions or comments, we can add during the later sessions on Q&A. I need your advice on how we can proceed from here. Or Nisha?
Dr. Combra, if it is okay with you, would you mind continued with the session to moderate?
All right, thank you. I will proceed then with the our next presentation. 9E will be an overview of the adult learning and education in the Pacific, our progress and stages. For this session, I'd like to invite Timothy Waileti, our Indigenous Maori, and to present on the Indigenous Maori and Pacific Adult Education Charitable Trust.
Dr. Combra, my apologies. Before we go on to the keynote, there's Mr. Ichiro Miyazawa from the UNESCO Regional Office. Item number...
Sorry for my oversight. Yes, before we go on to that, we'll have session number 90, presented by Ichiro Maezawa from UNESCO Pacific Regional Office.
Thank you so much, Chair, and good morning, everyone, distinguished guests and the officials. Very nice to see you. My name is Ichiro Miyazawa, UNESCO Bangkok. Bangkok time right now is 7:25. Very nice to see you and good morning. Let me try to briefly explain the objective of this sub-regional consultation and also the Asia Pacific Conference, which is taking place in September, almost end of September. Basically, we want to look at 5 key points about adult learning education. Number 1, let's look at its status and trend of adult learning education in Pacific regions. Number 2, let's look at specific challenges and issues which we have been seeing many decades already, right? Last decade, even 20, 30 years ago, we have been looking at the common issues and challenges to promote adult learning and education. So let's review again. And number 3, as Aya-san mentioned, let's look at the impact of COVID, and of course, positively and negatively. And it's easy for us to talk about something negative, right? But then it's also important for us to look at the positive impact, because some changes are happening right now, especially for the adult learning and then lifelong learning. Number 4, related to this number 3 point, let's look at the innovations, innovative approaches, which is taking place on the ground, but not only on the ground. Let's look at the policy and the budget-wise too. Lots of new challenges and then new changes are coming up. That's important for us to look at, review. And then finally, since we look at, we are meeting today as sub-region, let's see what kind of collaboration we can create over these Pacific regions. And then all input, suggestion, discussion point is going to be somehow summarized as a regional, let's say sub-regional recommendation, which is going to be submitted to the next Asia Pacific Conference in September. And then after that, as a region, Asia Pacific, since it's big, right? We make a summary of recommendation and we will submit it to the Morocco Conferencia next year. So that's the basically main point I wanted to mention in given time. Thank you so much. And then let's hope we have a very productive, active discussion to promote adult learning and education. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Chiro, for your very brief presentation and very lively presentation from Bangkok. We would now have our next presenter, who will be the keynote presenter, looking at the progress of adult learning and education in the Pacific. I'd like to now invite Dr. Timothy Waiolete to make the presentation, and thereon also we will have inclusive, after the presentation, the question and answer session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May we please share our screen from this end? Change the plan. No? Oh, I did try. Are you able to share from your end? Because we seem to be having problem from this end.
1 second, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Te watapu ki ngahi o i ki ngahi whanua. Te watapu i ngahi taki o ngahi ako. O ta whakataha he ngalo ia ka mai ope o ia. Too low, too low, too low. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Aya, and thank you, Ichiro, for actually setting the framework for my address. I'm very grateful. Some of you may have access to the PowerPoint, and I'm not going to actually spend too much time on the executive summary. Move down, please. Oh, next one, please. Next slide. The executive summary are the headings that Ichiro was talking about, and the chair and I referred to as well. I'd like to go on to the context because we need to locate ourselves in the Pacific because our adult education are very unique to us. We are 17 nations: Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, New Zealand, and Australia. Different races, different economies. 2 of them are first world, and the rest of us are very far behind. Education for us is a context. Education is very important. It was important before pre-context time. Currently, it is still very, very important. We put a lot of focus and resources in our compulsory education, but for AO, not so much. Another context that we have is that we are in small lying islands exposed to the rising seas and extreme weather. And our culture are based on our work, which is not necessarily just industrial work, but a work that we perform in order to maintain our families. Are we all right? We carry on?
Sorry, our connection was not strong enough for PowerPoint, so we were trying again. Thanks.
Oh, could you enable us so we can run it from this end? Is it us? See. Are you able to allow us to run the PowerPoint from this end?
If you'd like, you should be able to share screen from the bottom of the your screen yourself.
We are disabled from your end. Okay. Maybe you should stop your screen share, Aya.
Timothy, the screen is there already. Would you be able to continue?
Yeah, sure. Next slide, please. The one after that. Right. So, as I said in my paper, that was part of the resources that was sent out. AO is not something, an area that's important, that's new to the Pacific. In fact, the majority of our education system prior to contact time were AO, informal and non-formal. It had a philosophy and it had a methodology to go with it. And those two are actually within a few lines from Tomasese, Tuiatua Tomasese, and I'll just say that quickly. And he said that I'm not an individual. I'm an integral part of the cosmos, that I share divinity with my ancestors, the seas, the skies, and the land. I'm not an individual because I share toffee with my family, my village, and my nation, that I belong to my family and my family belongs to me. I belong to my village and my village belongs to me. I belong to my nation and my nation belongs to me. This is the essence of my sense of belonging. Now, I say those there because within those lines is the philosophy that drove our own education. Ako is a concept that's used in Polynesia, and it's about learning to know yourself and know those who are around you and know the environment. And then what you do, the tofi or the whatongia that you carry out in order to maintain the integrity of that relationship. So as I said, our ako had a philosophy and a methodology. And that was about, if the world population is 75 grown-ups, adult, then really that's a significant part of the education system. If our population between 0 and 14 is 25%, then maybe we need to look at distributing the resources in order to actually support both sides, because two are in partnership in education. I'll go to literacy because that's really interesting, and Aya talked about ICT. How can we use that? COVID-19 have actually exposed a lot of injustices that were layered over by the day-to-day living. And when disasters like that removes the blind in the cover that actually hide away some of the injustices that we experience in the Pacific. And I go back to my story about literacy. The methods of Talanoa were the methods that I referred to. They were driven, that carried the philosophy that I talked about of serving people, respecting, and actually fitting into a society that actually contextual to the Pacific. But we still can use the methods in ways. For example, I hear from Indonesia usually how they use and they learn actually to operate the computers. So therefore they were able to actually take part in the conversation within the village. So therefore the voice of women came through. So there were more women who were involved in the discussion, but they were using the Talanoa and talk story, but using a methodology that actually knew that that's ICT, but driven by the old ways, which is talk stories and Talanoa. I'm not going to spend too much time on digital illiteracy and literacy because I will talk more about it later. The other point that I put up is the importance of education. It's a priority to all Pacific people actually value education, but do we value AO? And if we don't, we need to ask ourselves why. As I said before, AO is in partnership with formal education. So therefore, we can't actually move one part of our society, the 25%, the young people. And I actually reminded, and I go back to a saying that was shared with us by Professor Kelly and reiterated by our chair yesterday at the end of the day. And that is, our youth is our stakeholder of the future. My challenge is that, how about we add on that the 75% and the rest of society are our stakeholder today, now, because if we don't deal with the issues now, then the future might be lost. And so you can't just focus on the future. We need to think about AL and the population. A 75% uneducated, illiterate population is no support for the 25 that we're focusing our focus on. There are crests at the moment. BLM, that's rising forces around the world that we can use, I suppose. It's moved some of the concept that we have in education in order to preserve our knowledge, indigenous knowledge. There are concepts, I see Talanoa has been used here, that came from AO, that came from formal, informal education, but used the vehicle of academia to actually spread it and preserve it. So there's a very strong possibility for partnership between informal, non-formal, and formal education. Next page, please. The priorities for the future action. I often wonder about our position as our own enemies at some stage. I wonder if we undervalue the IO because we have some psychological block that actually encourage us to forget about how we got to now as Pacific peoples. Our ways have been proven over many, many years. And really, we cannot actually move along if we don't move along ourselves. I mean, I'm often saddened by hearing stories. Some of our people, our villages are 90% illiterate. And I often ask myself, but how do these people talk? How do they actually have meeting? Really, if we are going to move our education, we need to start from ourselves. We can do that. We don't need anybody else to change those. Until we move ourselves and actually treasure the knowledge that we actually we're passed down, freeze them into formal education, then really we have some issue. Diversity of issue. We are huge. I'm reminded of our diversity when the chairperson of this conference from a small rock nation of Niue with an average of what, 2,000 population, passed over the chair to a huge country with 8 million people, huge country. So the trouble with our area is the diversity. Languages, it stretched from people who are struggling with literacy, people who are struggling with access to towns, to actually take NGO work, to some people who are wanting a seat at AUL board. So, you know, how do we condense those to actually come out with something that are specific that's going to stand some test in the international conventions? For example, the meeting in 2022 of Confintia 7. Long-term challenges, we have got partners in governments, and I don't need to actually raise that. In the last 3 CRAOs, only 4 Pacific states took part on those reports. The priorities, I think, is very important. I go back to my favorite session the other day with Dr. Wing. We actually talk about, you know, if you're serious about something, legislate it, okay? Legislate it and then fund it, build some structures around it, and apply it again to see where you've gone wrong. Next page, please. Climate change. And the climate change existed before COVID-19, and it's going to be here after COVID-19 goes. It is specific to the Pacific, and I ask that we consider the issues around that very, very seriously. In Europe, they did a survey there, and they find out that when the workplaces got shut down, 25% of informal learning is lost, 18% of non-formal work is lost. If you apply that research in the Pacific, places like, say, the Marshall, Kiribati, where there's a possibility land will be lost, fishing ground will be lost. The amount of adult learning happens in those learning spaces when parents take kids fishing or planting, which they can't do anymore. Imagine it's not a 25% lost or 18% lost within 10 or 2 or 3 years, but forever. COVID-19 crisis on adult learning and education, loss of health and life. You know, inequality exists everywhere. It exists in the Pacific, and when we go overseas, they exist there too. We seem to export those with us. So loss of health, there was an interesting study by Hafuka. The next page, please. They found that our population, Pacific people in the States, are first world nation. We're 2.5 times higher than the average US. We're still where our people, our Micronesians and our Polynesian concentrate, and that's Salt Lake City. They were 4 times higher than the average population there. So, So that's when we start to think, is our problem located in the Pacific itself, or is it a bigger issue? It's a worldwide issue. So the problem is not just us, but everybody else too, the environment. So is it just us that need education, or is it other people that need education as well? The next one from that was the collapse of the informal village economy. I mean, how often actually refer to sorry?
So we are running beyond time. I'd like to ask you to
sure, Mr. Chairman. Sure. Okay. Private economy, I'm going to skip those, Mr. Chair, and I just want to share some happy stories. Meti, who actually taught about 25 villages about self-help. Partnership example from Aotearoa, where ACE actually shared management of the organization, where they said that 50% of the board and management would be consisted of local Māori, and the rest of them 50. Impact is working between New Zealand and the Pacific for development and transfer of education. Kiripas, they're learning about new ways of planting from Asia. And I'll just go on, skip the next one, which is an example. And I'll go to the last one, Mr. Chairman, please. Last one, I think I want to highlight a work that has been carried out by ASFE, and those good examples that I showed before. We're members of ASFE, an organization with 200 members, 30 countries, and the transfer of knowledge between those countries has been very helpful for members in the Pacific. Number two I want to refer to is the work between NZQA, UQAP within SPCA, and actually putting qualification to the prior knowledge of people. Now, a challenge from there is that where do you actually secure Indigenous knowledge to be part of that, to preserve the knowledge as well as getting people ready for work. The other one too is the one that country support. April 2020, New Zealand government gave NGOs 16 million to actually support their effort with the whānau in the community. $6 million for disabled and 4.8 to support community endeavor. Now that's an example of actually legislation and funding and then follow up. I'm going to leave it there, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy, for the very well informative session that you have taken us through to give us an update of the issues and also challenges that are facing the Pacific region and of the priorities that we need to set for the future direction to give attention to adult learning and education in the region. This presentation plus the two or three prior presentations have given us enough information and given us time to ponder over for the breakup sessions that will happen in session number 10. But before we ask Sandy Morrison to give us an introduction to the breakup session or explanation to the breakup session, I'd like to open the floor for any questions and comments. Given time, we will just restrict to 2 or 3 questions or comments. If you can manage this, because I cannot be able to access the chat platform.
Yes, Dr. Kambra will monitor the chat.
The floor is open for any members of PHES or participants to voice any questions or comments. To David, Aya, Ichiro, and of course, Timothy, on the presentations that they've made. Silence.
Mr. Bernald has hand up.
All right. Let's proceed.
Thank you very much. Just listening to the comments so far and thinking about adult learning and education in the Pacific, I'm wondering how we can break through to decision makers, especially in ministries of education and ministries of finance, about finding resources to fund adult learning and education. We all know it's important. We all know that adult learning has been under-resourced for decades and decades. And even if we wanted to improve the education of children, we know how essential it is for adults to be at least literate and have some basic adult education. That's when children can go home to households and where literacy is there's literacy and there's support by parents to their children. So I'm wondering, how do we break through with political leaders to financially support adult education in the Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Any members of the presenters who would like to respond to that comment? Timothy, you would like to have a go?
What if I say no, Mr. Chair? Yeah, I think pressure would have to come from the community, but I think industry has got a bigger voice than the community. For example, say New Zealand and Australia, they operate the SWP and RSE, and the pressure from the employers is to improve the skill of these people who come over, and because they have the money behind them, so the government has actually opened up budget to make sure that these people are trained. So when they come back, they're far more educated. But again, it's not a community aim that they are actually funding. It's really about their own benefit as well. So if we get together, and I suppose as a group, and I mentioned 75% of the population apply pressure on each government, I'm sure they would give in. But it's about crossing, I suppose, the barriers between ourselves and look at a bigger aim and put our weight behind it and pressure our governments.
Thank you, Timothy. Is there any further question or comment? Thank you. As I have indicated earlier, we will have a breakup session in session 10. And if you have questions or comments to make, we can take this up in that session after our short break very soon. But let me at this juncture thank all the presenters and every participant for the sessions we've just concluded. The sessions now laid the foundation by providing updates and progress of the challenges of adult learning and education in the region, as well as the objectives of the consultations for our discussion in the next breakout session. I would now like to ask Sandy Morrison from the Waikato University to give us explanation of the breakup sessions before we take a break. Sandy, please.
Greetings, friends and colleagues from around the Pacific. I'm coming to you from New Zealand, and as Dr. Combra, with thanks for your chairmanship, has introduced, I'm at the University of Waikato, but also work for the NGO Impact as well. So I'm going to be helping to facilitate the breakout sessions. And the whole objective of the breakout discussions is to break up so that countries can present short reports on the state of adult education in their country and start to address, as we've heard by the speakers before me, the specific challenges, the impact of now not only COVID-19 but also climate change, as Dr. Violetti has also made that significant input into our discussions, and has also prompted discussion on innovative practice and also how we can work across the Pacific to further these aims. So each group has already been divided up. So Group A is Australia, Fiji, PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. And your moderator for the session is Dr. Kilala Devet-Shi, and the rapporteur is Te Pora Wright from Samoa. So that is Group A. Group B has the countries Kiribati, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Nauru. So I've forgotten what RMI is. RMI. And your moderator is Jack Callisto, and the rapporteur is Annalise Robertson. Cook Islands, but she's the director of Aotearoa. Group C, Cook Islands, New Zealand, Niue, Samoa, Tukalau, Tonga, and that's moderated by Shirley Coble, with myself as the rapporteur. So as I said before, your groups have actually been predetermined. And so having said that, for the development partners, they have the option to change later, but we're asking the country presenters to please stay within your groups, and please do not move around groups, whereas there will be room for other NGOs, civil society who aren't doing the presentations to change by clicking on the little 4 square icon once you're in your breakout group. Now each group, Group A, B and C, after our wellness break, they will have 10 minutes each to present. That's the country presentations will be 10 minutes each, and that's including questions and answers. So moderators, please be attentive to time. We're asking the rapporteurs to take note, and then they will report back in the session following the country presentation break. All in all, we have 1 hour, 20 minutes for this session before our next break, and you will automatically be joined back into the full conference like what we have now. I think that is all I have to say. I'm not quite sure if there's any questions. Following a 10-minute wellness break, when you come back on, you will probably find yourself in your allocated groups. So with those instructions, Dr. Combra, I'd like to conclude my session and just reiterate that we're really looking forward to taking your thoughts forward so that they can form the report from the Pacific as we prepare for Confintia 7 next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, for the explanation. We know after the wellness break of the 10 minutes, we will be put into different groups. And we will come back after the breakup groups for session number 11. And our moderator would be Franco Rodi, Permanent Secretary for Education from Solomon Islands. So I'll see you in about 1 to 2 hours time. Thank you. Please keep your Zoom's connections on, and we will come back right after the 10 minutes wellness break. Thank you. Sorry, just to give you a clear time for this break, it's 11 o'clock PNG time, so we'll resume at 10 past 11. Thank you.
bunga ma dangi meran bening aya bunga ma dangi meran bening aya bunga ma dangi meran bening ran bening aya bunga ma dangi bonongo lili good mara boy lili good mara bomi lili good mara aya bunga ma dangi meran bening aya bunga bongama dangi meran bening aya bongama dangi bonongo lili good mara bomi lili good mara boy lili good mara aya bongama dangi meran aya bongama dangi meran jija kata
Launoko manuko ta fecha de fila yera ya launoko manu viria bu ni me fango na vao ni me shiki shava dabo launoko manuka ya launoko manu yera ya launoko manu awetu kuso aya va no romano ronto wa que tu guso san va kawia resa tu goma to swano tangia ta ko e no parikai aya va santo kuwa ritara fa noi giadei va no romano kaya va no romano Yera yeva no romano wetu guso. Ayeva no romano ronto wa que wetu guso.
Excuse me, Aya, will we be going into groups soon?
Yes, Sandy, check in. Welcome back, everybody.
Government of Niue, which include churches. There are 5 mainland churches and NGOs, as well as in our system, provincial education authorities that provide and support community-based adult learning and literacy program. Currently, in the program that we are implementing, there are 80 literacy teachers who are hired to work with 40 communities throughout the country to provide literacy training to about 3,000 literacy learners. We also have the Literacy Association, which is working with 60 community church leaders and 4 provincial officers to manage this work. On the specific challenges and priorities for future action to promote adult learning and education and practices, like other Pacific Island countries maybe, although we have made great strides to reach the level of achievement in terms of promotion and improvement of adult learning and education and practices, there are of course a lot of challenges that we encounter. And these challenges will need to be addressed as we progress. So funding is a challenge. Although the government provides some funding to the organizations that I've mentioned, there's always limited funding. And so those organizations can work within the budgets that they are given. There is also a need to build capacity in terms of the work that is carried out, especially the activities and programs that target adults in the communities. So that needs more work as well as resources, so that we can be able to reach out to those adults that need to be supported, so that they can be able to achieve or be able to read and write and use information to the best of their ability. Next, the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on adult learning and education. Although we haven't recorded a COVID case in our country, when we decided to close schools and institutions in our country, it impacted on our learners, both those in the schools as well as in tertiary education institutions. So we closed our institutions and schools for almost 7 months last year. And so we had to find other means or ways to help our students and adults to continue with their learning. Currently, we haven't had community transmission as in other countries, but of course there are challenges. The COVID-19 has impacted on our education sector, our economy, and so we are experiencing difficulty in terms of reaching out and continuing with our program that we plan for this year. So in some cases, we have to close down or discontinue the programs because we have budget cuts, as well as other things that we couldn't do because of the restrictions that have been imposed on us under the state of public emergency. So next is, what else can we do in terms of the progress and the improvement that we would like to see in adult education and practices? Well, we have we are just about to complete our National Education Action Plan 2021-2025, and in the draft that we have indicated, inclusive education, so that we can be able to identify activities and programs that would enhance improvement, for example, numeracy and literacy levels of our adults, either in the senior secondary school level or at tertiary education level, as well as our people in the communities. There is also a new Education Act that we are working on, and it's going to be tabled to Parliament. And so this will pave a new direction for our education. And we are also emphasizing compulsory education, which is good, so that we can be able to reach out to those communities, students, adults who may have not been able to educate themselves to the level where we expect them to be. And so, although this is a challenge, this is our dream and aspiration as we continue to make improvement in terms of educational outcomes in the country. The area that we are grappling with, which is also outlined in our new education plan, is to reach out to those children with learning disabilities, as well as adults, as well as those adults with physical disabilities. So it's a challenge, but we have indicated in our plan, so that we do not only look at the outputs in terms of improvement in the area of adult literacy, for example, but also to rethink and, of course, set aside an affordable budget that the government can provide, so that we can train those kids, adults, students in high schools, as well as people in the communities. So all in all, I think I have covered some of the things that I wanted to say. So thank you so much for listening to my story. Okay, so I've finished, moderator.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so I was on. Thank you very much for the presentation. Let's see if there are any questions. We'll leave it end. We'll now give the opportunity to Vanuatu to do their presentation.
Sorry, Kilala. I just got a note here from Nisha that Vanuatu is not present. So perhaps we could go to questions and answers at this time.
Okay, thank you so. Yes, thank you so much for that. We have a lot of time, so and now I'll leave it to the floor for questions. So if you have a question to ask any of the presenters so far, please do so now. It's about 42 minutes. Anyone, any questions, comments?
Kilala, while our participants are thinking of their questions, I wonder if I could ask a question.
It's fine, go ahead.
And thank you to all the presenters for your sharing and your stories today. And I was just wondering, given that, you know, there have been so many struggles and challenges in each of the countries in terms of the outlook for adult learning and education, I was wondering if there were any success stories that we might share from each of the contexts, you know, some good things that have been happening, perhaps.
That's a good point there. We've been talking about challenges and issues, but I think it's time we also talk about the good things that we have seen in our countries. So can we have some good stories from any of the countries who would like to share with us?
Hello, I would like to just briefly tell you some of the success stories in terms of adult education in the area of literacy. You would note that during my presentation, I talked about non-governmental organizations and associations, which is made up of churches, who have conducted literacy training to some of our adults, particularly women. As you would be aware, in Melanesia, particularly in the Solomon Islands, when it comes to education, even at this age and era, parents would normally give more chances to the girls. Excuse me. So as a result, you know, some female adults were not able to read or write at the proficiency level that we wanted them to. So the students groups have conducted training to groups of women, and I've seen video clips of those women who were able to read for the first time, as well as to write in their own vernacular. And so, you know, the training is conducted in the community's vernacular. And so when you know, the smile on the faces of these women who were not able to read when they were children or adolescents, and they were able to read when they did after their training, it's really amazing, and the change that occurred to them. So that is one a success story, and we are continuing on that. But again, as I said, Solomon Islands, like Papua New Guinea, and then probably Vanuatu, you know, because so many islands. So transportation, the logistic, as well as resources can be problematic. But I'm sure we can be able to achieve those outcomes in terms of the proficiency or competencies of adults who may have had less education, and therefore we can be able to reach out to them through these means. So that is one piece of story.
Thank you, Franco. That's very impressive. It's good to learn about good things that our countries are doing also with regards to literacy, improving literacy in our countries. Any other comments from anyone else before I give my own comments about the support of my two colleagues there, Ms. Kona and Mr. Nembo?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Felipe.
Yeah, Felipe, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to share and see what experiences the countries have in terms of some adult informal experiences in some of our remote rural communities. Let me talk about the situation here in Fiji, my island, which is in the Lau group. We are renowned as wood carvers in Fiji, so we are craftspeople. And
thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Bertha. I see that you had two questions. I thought your name was Tongan, your first one. Secondly, Yes, Beth, we have written widely about adult education. We actually wrote an article on benchmarking Indigenous research, but we're very happy to actually send you some of the material that we have written.
Awesome.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it'd be good to have access to this document so our people can read it and be inspired, even if they have to write their own stories, and because that's another way to motivate them to learn. I mean, a lot of people usually talk down to others and say, why it's past expiry date, why are you still learning and all that stuff. So, it's also that stigma, the negative stigma of arrows going back into the classroom that we need to overcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You may have seen or heard about Manulua philosophy. You may have heard about the Talanoa methodology. So those are widely accepted in academia now. In fact, Talanoa research methodology is the most cited Pacific research out there in Google. So our concepts are out there and been used by people because obviously what's available up there is not sufficient to capture all that knowledge and that people want to, and so they're looking for alternative. But certainly we're happy to actually share with you our knowledge, what we have actually put together.
Excellent, that'd be good. Thanks.
Marlo.
Thank you, Timothy. Do we have others who would want to make some comments or have any questions? Michelle?
And Shirley, just before you go there, just to say that we've been joined from Gail Townsend from UNICEF, I think, still in the Pacific, and Miss Nisha, who heads UNESCO Samoa. They've added into our group as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Sandy.
Hi, Sandy. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Gail, and who's the next participant? Ichiro, okay. So we still have time if
Shirley?
all the, but yeah.
Shirley, can I just add on, I forgot while I was talking with that UNESCO and the University of Waikato and Impact actually jointly work with the Ministry of Education, Kiribati, a few years ago to redesign their curriculum, this school curriculum, because the current or the old one was designed in Australia some 40 or 50 years ago. So they just found at the event of climate change, their school curriculum were not as appropriate actually to their need. So one of the main things you'll be interested to hear with is that they ask us to go out to the community to learn as much about their cultural knowledge and develop it in a way that it could be accepted into the classroom and get taught. So it's a way of actually fortifying their culture formally. So we did it for a while, and I understand it's still being used by Kiribati. So that was a way of bringing the experience from outside, their adult learning from outside, from the community to the classroom in order to actually make it official. Now, somebody was referring to that as mainstreaming, our cultures, our, if you like, even somebody talked about micro qualification, or, it's
No? Or otherwise you can just verbally
sort of yeah. Okay.
Sure. Okay, I'll just do it verbally. Thank you. So for question 1, state of the arts of adult learning and education, I noted 4 common themes and bullet points. That there's a focus on vocational and trade skills, a focus on literacy and numeracy, including for some Indigenous languages. Also pathways to qualifications, so ranging from community, colleges, high schools through to university, and generally the demographic of the learner is 16 years and over. But I hope that captured some of the key points for the state of adult learning and education. Is there anything that I've missed that I can include in there? No, I'll move on to the next question.
Yes, move on.
So question 2, specific challenges and priorities. So I've noted 3 key points for this question, again from both presentations. One is access, and I can elaborate on that. The second one is looking at capabilities, so upskilling of the workforce and staff, and also capacity, so having enough people or workers. The third point that's been raised under challenges and priorities is internet connectivity, and that's been a common thread, I think, across all of the countries as well. So that's what I've captured for question 2.
Yeah.
To move on?
Yeah, move on.
Question 3 is looking at the impact of COVID, and very similar to the from the second question.
The skills that people are gaining are the skills that the economy is looking for. And I think we did learn that over COVID, but we've also through COVID got a really far more active Chamber of Commerce and private sector that are now actually, telling us a lot about what they're wanting. So that partnership with private sector too, because you don't need to build hundreds of really flash TV or adult education classrooms. You can use employment-based learning. And I know like the local supermarket, for instance, puts a lot of their people through certificates and stock control and those kinds of things. And it gives people success. And once they've got success, they'll be willing to test themselves a bit more and try something else. I really hope this is what Danielle meant. There she goes. Yeah, we have been COVID-free and still are, and most of us are vaccinated. The fees, it is ongoing. Okay, so the fees-free initiative will continue, which is absolutely fantastic. So it has also been for USP courses at the local campus, although I know government was really, their focus was on more people who perhaps hadn't been engaged for a long time, or had been working in the hospitality sector and wanted to retrain into something else, just to have that extra set of skills to pivot and find new income for families. And next, innovative practices. Yeah, citizenship education is massive. Lots and lots of stuff on ESD and global citizenship. I think the Cooks has always loved it and always will. The canoe is certainly our people who are in the Cooks, that's for sure. Yes, use of IT. We now do have fibre. It doesn't actually go to any of our houses yet, but I'm sure it will soon. but that is going to make a huge difference. And I think the fact we were really showed up here, I know Danielle mentioned it to me early on in COVID, that actually our teachers and our students on our outer islands were much better at things like Zoom than ones on the main island who hadn't been relying on it for so long already. So it was actually really good to see that and to be able to use that as evidence for more investment in that area as well. There we go. How was that? But please,
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gail.
That was not the Ministry of Education, okay?
That was great, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Well done.
A very unofficial report back.
Well, I did a New Zealand report too.
Oh, okay. There we go then, Sandy.
So do we have any questions for Gail?
Well, sorry, I was just going to say with the opening up of the borders now, I just missed it because when COVID was in place, all training was made free. So that's still carrying on in spite of the borders being open?
At the moment,
it's really a challenge, challenging thing for us here at the moment. And I guess listening to those two reports, something similar in that context also been mentioned in terms of the challenge that face because of the diversity of also the what our governments are doing. It's still a lot more yet needs to be done. And what you've said in terms of the community involvement is very, very important because everything it starts at home. We learn our language from our families, our cultures from our families, the environment that we live in also from home. And even in disasters, we always call home as a place where you feel secure. And in the case here in Solomon Island, when the COVID-19 last year, most of the people, they went home because they feel that it's more secure at home than here in the urban centers. Well, that's all my comments from there. Is there anyone else? So unless you have anything else to say while we are waiting to join the large group?
Jack, I've just added the recommendations that were read out earlier, so I've added that to the presentation as well, or our summary notes.
Okay, that's good. How much time do we have left now?
Five more minutes, Jack.
5 more minutes.
Yes.
So we have 5 more minutes to go. Is there any other burning comments or you want to share with us?
Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you all back from your plenary. I trust you had very good discussions in your groups. I observed this in our plenary group. In this concluding session of the day, we will discuss essentially there are three sessions that we will, sub-sessions we will have. Including in the final session, we look at our recommendations or the Pacific's recommendations on today's sessions on the Confitia number 7. So with this, I would like to invite on our behalf Dr. Franco Rodi, the Permanent Secretary for Education, the Minister of Education in the Solomon Islands. to moderate the final session for today. So, Dr. Roddy, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair, and welcome everyone to this session, which I have been asked to moderate. So I'll go straight to what we need to talk about. In order for us to manage time, we are only given 25 minutes, which includes 5-minute reporting. It's followed by 5 minutes clarification on the questions and answers. So in this session, we will hear report back from breakout discussions. Following the reporting, we will attempt to reach out to our specific regional recommendations on adult learning and education, or L for short, to fit into Confin Tier 7. So without further ado, we will first hear reporting from groups as well as civil society organizations' recommendations. After all reporting is completed, we will have a brief question and answer time for clarifications. So to do that, there are a couple of questions that you have been provided in the paper, so you can refer to those questions, or if you have any other questions that you would like to ask. So please keep note of your questions. We request that any comments and inputs to be discussed during the next segments, technical discussions and sub-regional recommendations. So Group A consisted of government representatives, CSOs, development partners, and other experts from Australia, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Thank you, Mrs. Kilala Divetri from the PNG National Institute for moderating that session. I now invite Ms. Deborah Wright from the University of Waikato to make a brief reporting in the time allocated for you to report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rowdy. Thank you for the opportunity. So our group was made up of representatives from Australia, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and we were not able to hear, sadly, from Vanuatu today. So to begin with, in terms of the current state of adult education and training and learning in the different countries, just a little bit about the situation in each country. In Australia, they've experienced reduced government funding for adult learners, and this has translated to more expensive fees for adult learners that might have considered enrolling into education and training programs. So understandably, the enrollments are reduced or become problematic. In Fiji, there's no entity responsible for adult learning and education. However, many major projects involving crop agencies and different NGOs involve significant components of adult training that see, thousands of adults from the community being trained or receiving training and skills training in different things, such as technical skills, rural farming, and skills to support small and medium enterprise. In the PNG, the government coordinates with some incentives in terms of funding assistance. Most of the programs are faith-based or run by non-state actors, but there is a desire to have more government involvement, and the government involvement that they want to see happen includes partnership with the faith-based providers and non-state actors. One of the things they want to see is to improve the literacy rate, the adult literacy rate from 63%, which was the figure recorded at the most recent census. In the Solomon Islands, the main players are also faith-based organizations, as well as some government agencies and NGOs that provide community-based adult learning programs. For example, there is a literacy program involving 18 literacy teachers who work across 40 communities, and they train up to a community of up to 3,000 literacy learners. And this is a project that involves the Literacy Association working with provincial officers. So there is a lot happening on the ground, but the challenges that each country continues to face. Right, there's a correction there with one of the things I said, if you could direct attention to it. So the challenges that they continue to face in some of in the bigger countries, it's of course the geographic layout of the country and hindering access to rural and remote communities. And with the COVID pandemic, different challenges such as the disruption of the continuity of programs because of the closure of institutions and lockdowns, the high cost of connectivity and mobile devices that could support adult training and learning is also constrained. Also in particular, adult learners faced with uncertainty of the future or have to make those decisions because of financial disruptions and job losses or job risk. So their learning or education might take a second priority. There's also something mentioned by Angela from Fiji about employers training sponsorship have either been reduced or cut completely because of business hardship or the economic downturn. And so however, the opportunities to expand online learning is often now considered more as a necessity instead of an option. So obviously improvement in connectivity in the cost, reducing the cost for adults to access that, as well as mobile devices to support their learning at a distance would be desirable. There were also, just to close off, there were also a few success stories that were shared by each of the different countries. And there are a lot of good and wonderful things that are happening on the ground in terms of literacy programs. For example, groups of women learning to read and write for the very first time and experiencing a transformative opportunity there with the operation of a certain adult learning program. And there are many similar experiences happening that of course could be scaled up to be at a bigger scale, to be experienced by more people. So overall, Mr. Chair, that was the summary of the discussion from our group. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your report of Group A. I shall now move on to Group B. As you would be aware, Group B included representatives from Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and Nauru. So I'm going to ask Mr. Jack Callisto from PHES Solomon Islands, who was moderating the group. Oh, sorry. I will now invite Ms. Annalise Robertson, Director of ACE Aotearoa, to share the reporting from this group. After the Group B reporting, Ms. Robertson will also share summary recommendations from CSOs. So am I clear with the instruction that I should give you in terms of who's going to report by? I think Jack is also going to provide a brief report followed by Annalise Robertson. Thank you.
Sorry, so yeah, Jackie, Annalise will do the report for Group B. She has summarized the reports from 2 countries, Palau and Nauru. So Annalise will do that.
Thank you, Jack, for the clarity.
Thank you. Question 1. So we have summarized the key points, and I note that Group A has some very similar and common also noted in our report back. So question 1, state of the art of adult learning and education. There's been a significant focus on vocational and trade skills. Also a focus on literacy and numeracy, which I also note includes Indigenous languages.
And Dr. Rhodey and Annalise, we can't actually hear you well, Annalise, so just wondering if you can come closer. Is that all right, Dr. Rhodey? Apologies, but we're struggling to hear.
I noted that I was also unable to hear most of what she said in the introduction, so I would suggest, Sandra, if you could move closer to the microphone so that you can be heard.
Thank you. Is that better?
That's a little bit better, Annalise.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. I'll speak up. So for question 1, state of the art of adults learning and education, we noted 4 key points from the country reports. The first one was a focus on vocational and trade skills. The second was increasing focus on literacy and numeracy, and we noted that this included Indigenous languages.
Put it on those.
The third point was looking at pathways to qualifications. So the starting from community colleges and high schools through to university. And also the demographic of the learner was from 16 years and above. The question 2, looking at the challenges and priorities, there were 3 key points that were noted. The first one was access, looking at geographical access, access to learning, and also with internet connectivity. The other point was capability. So some of the challenges around upskilling of staff and workers, and also with the existing capacity within CSOs, that there was an increasing demand, but not enough workers. Question 3, looking at the impact of COVID-19. Similarly, access was noted as one of the impacts. Also with capability, upskilling of staff, and also capacity. Internet, again, was noted as one of the impacts, as we saw a number of providers from the countries moving online or using a range of both face-to-face and online. And also people generally with COVID, people were going home for security and prevention reasons. So the shift from learning was located at home and raised the characteristics of family learning and intergenerational learning as well. Question 4, looking at innovative practices. For a shift to community outreach, so being very responsive to need. CSOs have been responsive to need, mostly located in the home and working directly with those who have been most affected, for example, low socioeconomic demographic. Also seen an increase in local community-led initiatives, so more local people being involved in lifelong learning, sharing local knowledge by local people, and an increase in no cost to address the access to learning as well. And the last question, looking at sub-regional cooperations, Commonly, the obvious cooperation was with universities, then the University of South Pacific, and also with donor countries in the region through scholarships and aid. In the group discussion, we also heard one of the recommendations and encouragement for countries was to consider rethinking education to integrate adult learning education and community education across sectors and to see it as a contributor to addressing COVID-19 impact, and also that we should be rethinking education to integrate adult learning education and community education so that it includes family and intergenerational learning. That's a report from Group B.
Thank you, Annalise, for providing a summary report of your group. Participants would note that I've not given 5 minutes as indicated in my notes for anyone to ask questions to each group. I will do that after the third group has given their report. So thank you once again, Alanis. I'm going to move now to Group C, who had representatives from Cook Islands, New Zealand, Niue, Samoa, Tonga, and Tuvalu. Ms. Sally Abraham from Pobel Vanuatu moderated the session. Thank you, Ms. Abraham. The reporter for this group is Professor Sandy Morrison from Waikato University. So can we hear the group's reporting or report now before we go on to the questions that anybody might have in relation to what has been reported to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rody. And like the other groups, I think we had very similar outcomes and similar discussions, so that's good to see. I think we just want to frame our recommendations in the framework of our cultural ways of being in the Pacific, and the reminder that traditionally we're oral people, and the reminder also that our mother tongues are very, very important to each of us. And that came out clearly because when we heard about the state of adult education, we heard all what the other groups have said, and we also thought that we needed to ensure that our cultural ways of being were brought into whatever adult education programs, but also that this starts from school as well. And an example of that is when we ask children to go and get a certain number of mangoes or fruit or fish, they're already learning maths. And sometimes our school system is so disconnected that if we don't start that connection and synergy early on, then our adult learning may also get more disconnected. So the state of adult education has to incorporate some of our values, and we weave that in where we can. And so like the other groups, yes, adult education is mainly located in some of the universities and the vocations and the trade. Literacy and numeracy still appears to be an issue in some countries, and that is picked up by NGOs. And the state of adult education does need more resourcing, which then takes us into the challenges as well. And in our group, like the other groups, it's the challenge of political input and resource, and that's sort of strengthening. Digital literacy is also noted in our group. Leadership training and capacity, again noted. And actually just the challenge of saying to ourselves that we know what adult education is, we just use different terminology. And so we have to remind ourselves that this has been part of our culture for many years. In terms of Impact 19, like the other groups, yes, it's disruption to work. In the Cook Islands, there wasn't any charge for the courses because it was important to note that everyone needed to upskill, and lots of people left, and that left little workers left in the country. In Niue, we had a very good example of a program from the ridge to the reef, and that was about climate change. So although we're talking about COVID-19, let's not also forget about what's happening in our environment, and AIL must respond also to the environmental constraints around climate change that we see ourselves. And the Ridges to Reef was a very good innovative program that was shared by Niue. And there's a large focus on youth throughout all of the countries that were in our group, with very specific targeted learning for youth. And I know that in many of our Pacific Islands, we have a large proportion of youth out of work, so that was good to see. The Cook Islands, well, it wasn't strictly a Cook Island report, but also examples of where the Ministry of Education can also go in and not only teach children in schools, but also teach youth, so that that intergenerational transfer of knowledge is not lost as well. Sub-regionally, and looking at the ways that we can collaborate, we've come together to prepare for Confintia, which is held every 12 years. Our group would like us to meet as a group. Let's not wait for every 6 years or every 12 years, but can we have regular updates with all those who want to carry on and participate, so that we build our own skills and knowledge in adult education, but we also form our relationships, and through that we can find ways of helping each other. And so we can grow our own capacity by actually taking the opportunity to use Zoom and forming our own informal ways of learning, which is what we're good at through our own talanoa. So those are some of the key things. Remembering also that we're an oral learning culture, and some of our oral traditions must be kept. Making an effort to break down that disconnect between some of the overseas curriculums and aligning it with our local context, and some of those challenges that I've already mentioned. So I guess that's just in addition to what we've heard, Dr. Rodi. Thank you very much from Group C.
Thank you so much, Professor Sandy Morrison, for your well-articulated report. You talked about what your group discussed in terms of what each country has been doing, as well as the challenges and way forward, particularly in the use of IT or internet, so that, you know, our people, particularly in the remote parts of a country, can also be able to access information and to use that to their advantage. Well, I'm not going to summarize everything that was reported. You heard all our three reporters, so I'm now going to give you time to ask questions to each reporter, and probably members of each of the three groups might want to respond or comment on some of the things to make it more clearer, if you like, on those points that were raised. So it's open to you participants, so that you can make you can raise questions as well as make comments, or you might want to deliberate further on what was discussed in each of your groups. So can we have questions or comments from you And you should ask to each of the reporters, and the others might want to respond. I'm going to give you, say, roughly 10 minutes so that we can go on to the next part of our session. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, Felipe.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a question. I heard on the last presentation that this conference happens every 12 years. And there was one of the recommendations to have our own consultation forums in between those 12 years, if I was hearing correctly, which is a very good suggestion to me. That I'm just asking UNESCO if there's any mechanism already in place where the regions provide their own ongoing dialogue in terms of the outcomes of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Professor Sandi, would you like to respond to that question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodi. I do notice Director Nisha's hand up, and given it was for UNESCO, maybe I can speak after she speaks. She may have a better suggestion than me.
Sorry, Sandra, I don't have a suggestion to offer. We still, you are our elder here, so we'll look forward to hearing from you. But I do have a question, because I was roaming between the groups, or among the three groups. In a different conversation, I heard similar challenges. One common challenge that came up from different groups was the issue of financing adult education, learning, and training. The second issue that came up was related to motivation. Because the practice of lifelong learning is not well established. Its linkages with the development outcomes. For example, in your session, you mentioned health, and what a difference it makes to have adult education support health outcomes. But these linkages are not well established, and adult education is seen more as just functional reading, writing, and arithmetical calculation. So it is seen more of an individual initiative than a state responsibility. The third problem I noticed, which was being discussed, was the issue of technology. And it was mentioned first by Fiji in Group A, and it kept coming up. And technology again poses another challenge if we are talking about functionally illiterate population, which probably knows how to use social media at the most, if at all they have access to internet. And that too is highly ambitious assumption to make for the whole of the Pacific, because there are parts of Pacific where internet connectivity, even on the mainlands, even for the capital cities, are extremely challenged, and cost of connectivity is unbearable. So what kind of technologies we can innovate and look at? Do they have to be internet based, or we could be looking at local connectivities in a very micro enterprise manner. And a final issue that came up in two of the groups, in one group quite openly and in the other group subtly, was related to social fears and stigma, that what people will, this is more at an individual level. So individuals feeling shy about learning, about volunteering to join education and training at an old age. And I think it will be useful to get some reactions and some reflections from the plenary, stepping outside the breakout groups and come up with some suggestions that we could look at. And indeed, it is true, the educational attainments, if we look at it not only in terms of 13 years of initial education, but if we look at education in context of the whole of population of a country, the differences among Pacific SIDS in particular are extremely wide. So how do we still keep adult education or adult learning and education as a priority agenda for the Pacific SIDS? Over to you, Sandra. Sorry for giving so many questions.
Dr. Rodi, if I may just have a small response. Is that okay, Dr. Rodi?
That's okay. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. I think that the questions raised by Ms. Nisha are very, very relevant, and I'm sure that there's other heads on this in this forum that would also like to add to that, and wonderful to have those inputs, and also that those challenges, read the linkages and the motivation. I did note that in the UNESCO PowerPoint presented by Aya earlier, that it was AIL linking into many of the themes, and just when we were looking at some of the group reports, that there was strong linkage to COVID-19. But from our group, we also talked about the linkages to the environment. So I wonder, as we hear from everybody else, if we just consider those points that she's raised and see what others have to add, because I'm sure we're going to have stronger sub-regional recommendations as a result, Dr. Rodi.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Probably, I'm sort of tempted to ask a question, Deborah, right? If you could just briefly mention, a recommendation that came out from our discussion in terms of the funding difficulties that some of the countries are facing in terms of promotion and progressing adult learning and education. Because I think the recommendation that was made by Bernard is quite interesting, apart from the other developments that were occurring in each of the countries that engaged in that discussion. So would you like, Deborah, to just mention that recommendation in terms of how we might be able to finance adult learning and education activities in the Pacific Island countries?
Sorry, Mr. Rodi, you were, oh, okay. Well, I will briefly reiterate. My apologies if I have missed that one. Yes, certainly there was the challenge of funding for programs for adult learning and education is a challenge in all of the countries. And in some countries where there was funding, it was cut due to COVID and business constraints as a result of the pandemic. So one of the recommendations from the group, yes, was for greater government will and advocacy to support to enable government political commitment that will result in better funding for such programs, to enable sustainability of such programs continuing in the future. And one of the areas in which such funding could be directed was with internet connectivity and access to learning devices that would make it possible for adult learners in the community, rural and remote areas to connect to the learning programs online. Does that cover what you thought might have been missing, Mr. Chair?
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your reaction to the question that I posed to you. Any reaction from the other groups in terms of what Sandra and Nisa highlighted? Or any other questions or comments? We got roughly, I think, less than 15 minutes to focus on our discussion or questions before we move on to the next segment of our session.
Excuse me, Dr. Rodey, just a reminder that we do have a voice from civil society who have met prior to this meeting, who would also like 5 minutes. That was an 11A, and those recommendations will be presented by Miss Annalise Robertson, who also presented for Group B. So just when it's appropriate for you to include her, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that proposal. I will allow Annalise Robertson to provide the recommendations as we plan to do so. Can we hear from Annalise Robertson on that aspect?
I noticed there's a question, a hand up by Jack Callisto. He's had his hand up for some time.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Jack Callisto, would you like to say something? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rowdy. Yeah, I just want to ask a question on the importance and value of community learning centers. Now, community learning centers, you all know that like in our countries, established within our communities, and that support for these centers to help literacy programs, youth programs, it is really a challenge. And I'm just wondering if they can get more recognized and get more support to really reach out to the community, and especially the remote and the marginalized group, because as we all know that in our countries, most of the people, they live in the villages, in the communities, and that is where these learning centers are established. We all know that finance is a problem, but again, it's an area of priority to really look into community learning centers as a place to really help and help, especially with adult education. I just want to point that, to raise that as an important, and also they contribute in terms of adult education within each country.
Thank you so much for your contribution in terms of community learning centers that need to be established or are already established. But I think the question of sustainability, how do we sustain those centers so that they can serve their very purposes that we intended they would be able to provide to the adult learners or children within the area where the centers are established. So here we are talking about resourcing community learning centers, and probably a classical example that I can share with you is that this was in the Solomon Islands, where we established 12 community centers. The funding that we needed at the time was provided by our development partners. However, you know, they were running very well in terms of providing the service, connection to the internet, and other things that the communities would like to use the center for. Unfortunately, we were not able to sustain every one of them. And I think our story in the Solomon Islands might be quite different from the other Pacific Island countries, but sustaining this kind of centers, which I would like to call learning centers, for the community is quite vital as we move forward. So thank you for bringing that concept of community centers and how we might be able to consistently use them so that we can be able to use that as the as a learning center. Thank you. Anybody has got any questions or comments on that before we move on to the recommendations that we want to hear from the CSO? Leonard, would you like to say something?
Dr. Rowley, I'd like to make a contribution, please. Timothy, Violet. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to pick up from Jake's contribution. Community learning center, and I'm sure the Japanese will support that because it's an area that have been very strong in community learning center. But I want to go back to the point that UNESCO made, Ms. Nisha. She talked about financing, and of course, you know, that's a problem that everybody has. But I go back to what I see it, you know, if adult education is important, then obviously people will put financing into those and prioritize it. I think our job is to convince the government how important it is, which goes back to Bernie's point before. How do we convince the government to recognize the importance of ALE? Because without the support of ALE, then it's, you know, it's a waste of time really to try and actually just throw money at the compulsory education area. The other point that Ms. Nisha was talking about is the motivation. I suggest that if credentials are given to identifiable portion of ALE, then it will be picked up. Not only it will be picked up by our people, but it will be valued and perceived. So I think it is important to continue that. I know that some countries are working on that. I know the Italians are working on that, working on portion of knowledge in order to acknowledge the contribution of migrants that come to Italy, finding their experiences and try and actually accredit them so that they contribute to the social richness of the country. I go to technology, and I'm a little bit disappointed because I thought the people in UNESCO were daring. Illiterate knowledge of, you know, ICT. I mean, when you think about it, does the car comes before the horse or the other way around? I think if the hardwares are there, then there are going to be more people using it. It's going to be beneficial for the country's economy, not just education. I know that the first world are trying to get on to the fast highway of technology for that very reason. So it's not just education, it's not just our villages, it's not just our young people, but our adult population are going to benefit from having the hardware in place. And once it's there, then it's going to motivate people to learn more and more about computers, about phones, etc. The third point is about the social fear and stigma. This is another way that we our culture actually have been dealing with at the moment. Fortunately or unfortunately I'll speak for Polynesians, is you grow up in a life that you are allocated a role. When you're a child, you're a child. There's certain things a child do. And when you go to school, you're a student. When you leave school, you work and you support the younger people. So there's a barrier, mental and psychological barrier to people flicking over. And that's, I see, there was a mention of the stigma or fear of being seen. Now you're grown, you're an old man or an old woman. What are you doing studying again? So again, it's recognizing where we are as a culture and work on that. And in that way, recognizing where we are, we can actually work on changing those and encourage people to fulfill their life, what's owned to them, and that's continuous living and benefiting from the knowledge and technology out there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Timothy, for further elaboration on what is possible and the need for governments to sustain, their commitments so that, the infrastructure that we need to expand further on for adult learning and education can be provided. I'm sorry, we are running out of time, so I'm going straight to the next segment of our session. So thank you so much to the reporters that have reported on the group's discussions. So next, I welcome Ms. Angela Babusu Bompong, Program Specialist, UIL, who will lead the technical discussion regarding issues in adult learning and education and lifelong learning, innovations and successful cases in ALE, implementation of Sustainable Development Goal, particularly target 4.6, and alignment of policies, strategies, and programs at country level. I would now like to request Dr. Sandy Morrison to lead the discussion to synthesize specific sub-regional recommendations for Consultation 7. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes, I hope so. Very well.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I am Angela Usubwampong from the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. Good morning. It is now 5:34 here in Germany. So good morning from Germany. I've been following this discussion. It was a vital discussion and a very fruitful and target-oriented discussion. So I'm very happy that I would be part of all the deliberations today that are vital for our deliberations in Morocco in 2022. I've just been asked, due to the time that is available, to shorten. Our technical discussion usually includes to reach back to the countries that have presented and ask them what will be their key 2 recommendations that they would like to take along, that they would like to include into the report of today. I would also like to add to Ms. Nisha, who has just presented us from the deliberations in the breakout sessions, some of her key aspects that she considers to be important, including funding, technical motivation, and stigma. I would also like to add teachers and adult educators. I would like to add this to this point. So these were my key 3 takeaways from the breakout sessions: ICT, skills, internet, funding and financing, and especially also the teachers, where we need to integrate in-service training, continuity in training, where we also need to give some stability in terms of what education, as an adult educator, what value it has for the community, for the learners themselves. So to value and recognize teachers as they are working, teachers as they are being trained, and teachers as they are giving also the quality to the educational situation. So thank you very much for the discussion. I would like to maybe take the opportunity and reach out to the countries which are here, country representatives, if there is an opportunity to take a few moments. Maybe I will start with Group A. I see that in Group A we have Australia, we have Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Solomon Islands. Is there a representative from Australia who would want to give us 1 or 2 key recommendations to take away from these deliberations to Morocco 2022? Microphone.
Well, hello, I'm not a representative from the government. I'm a civil society representative based in Australia.
Right.
I would like to support two points that have been made through these last couple of hours. One was the importance of financing for adult learning and education is crucial, because in many places, especially in the Pacific, where economies are small and there's a significant reliance on overseas aid, it's important that funding is found to enable proper adult learning and education. The second point I would very strongly support is the comment made a few times, was the need to provide better internet access and reach, especially in rural and remote areas, at a much cheaper price to bolster the chances of people getting access and getting online and having access to tablets and laptops, perhaps through the community learning centres that were also promoted. I thought that was a very important strategy.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This already takes the aspect of community learning centers to another level, where we see that it does not necessarily only provide an infrastructure for adult learning education within the vision of lifelong learning, but it also enables to provide access to those in rural areas and those who have been or might have been deprived from educational opportunities. May I ask the representative from Fiji to provide us with 1 or 2 recommendations from Group 1? Do we still have the representative from Fiji Islands, Fiji here? If not, we would move to Papua New Guinea.
Yes, thank you. Papua New Guinea is on the financing part of it. If funding can be found either in country or through funding from the donor countries to enable us to increase the literacy rate in all places or districts in Papua New Guinea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was short and concise, and also highlights the aspect of funding and financing, and relates it also to the aspect of increasing the value, advocating and showing the effects and benefits of adult learning education, so that funding is reached through the government and other funding opportunities. May I ask the representative from Solomon Islands, if there is a representative from Solomon Islands still with us? No, I think in Group B, we had Nauru. That was our only country representative. Do we still have somebody from Nauru with us? I think from the presentation, it was very much to see that the aspect of funding was also mentioned, and also I think equivalency education. So we will take this up as well. So we don't have a representative from Nauru. From Group C, I think Sandra will be able to help me out. Who is in Group C available? I think we have a representative from Cook Islands.
I think we should go to Niue, because the Cook Islands was an informal report and Niue had very strong recommendations.
All right, let's have the representative from Niue.
Thank you, Angela. The two recommendations that I would support would be the first one, mother tongue and cultural values should be the overarching pillar for any training in ALE. And number two is political will at any country level, as that would also enhance the progress of ALE. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think political will is something that we will all be able to sign, and that we will strongly work on in providing the data and also the good practice case studies that show the benefits and the positive impact of adult learning education. From Group C, do we have New Zealand with us?
Maybe I can just ask Annalise Robertson, because she is the head of the adult community education, and maybe Annalise from the ACE sector, just what would be one recommendation to add into this?
Very well.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Angela. I think what has been commented on similar issues that we have been facing. So I think looking at the role of ALE in the pandemic, but more so from a social justice perspective, has been a theme that has come across from our sector. So not narrowly defined through contribution to employment and education only, but looking at the broader outcome spectrum of where ALE contributes.
Is this also related to the benefits and the positive impact of adult learning education and showing the benefits? Right. Very well, very well, very good. Would we have a representative from Samoa?
No, Angela, we don't have a rep from Samoa, Tonga, or we had an informal report from Nauru, but that's not to be taken as a country report, and the Cook Islands sent their report in, but the representative wasn't able to be present.
Okay, so I think we are almost through, and I would say that from the discussion, the deliberations, we can very much synthesize that one of the key aspects that will be taken as a recommendation to Morocco will be adequate and sustainable funding and financing of adult learning education. That will be key as an input from Australia. We will also look into, as it was mentioned already, ICT and technology. Technology also being mentioned by Ms. Nisha as one of the aspects. One of the conclusions was to provide access to technology through, for instance, community learning centers. And there are opportunities to use community learning centers as well for offline training and offline access to learning opportunities. So there are opportunities that are being tested in this kind already in other countries and other regions. So this will be opportunities to choose and to use. We have mother tongue. I think Sandra also mentioned culture. We have to preserve our cultural heritage. Language is a strong part of it. So mother tongue language and teaching will be very important as one of the specific recommendations from this sub-region. Political will, of course, political will is key. Political will is the driver for adult learning education, not only for adult learning education, to have a quality adult learning education, to have policies that are strong, to have coordination mechanism at a national level. And we also look into what is the role of adult learning education, particularly also taking in consideration the effects of the pandemic. How did the pandemic affect the adult learning education and the role of adult learning education in informing the population on how to better maintain their health facing the pandemic, and also looking into how to create awareness of the pandemic and how to preserve their own health. So the role of adult learning education linked with health, and health education will be very strongly also a theme in Morocco that we will discuss, and looking into how adult learning education can be included into the recovery, COVID recovery plans of countries that they are now developing. So I've been asked to be short and concise as I could be, and we have taken the recommendations from you. We will make sure that they end up in this report of this meeting, and they will surely also end up in the regional report. And when it comes to developing the regional report, it will be submitted to the deliberations in Morocco. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angela, for the discussion on the recommendations that came out from the discussions that we just had. Probably I confused you when I introduced Angela and then Dr. Sandy for the next section. So sorry about that. So we are almost done. But now I'd like to call upon Dr. Sandy Morrison to lead the discussion to synthesize specific some regional recommendations for contents here. I understand, that there were some questions raised as well as comments, but some of the questions that you might want to put at the back of your mind as we discuss this as follows. How are information and communication technologies affecting ALE? Any public-private partnerships we can learn from? Second one is, what knowledge, tools, or data be useful to advance ALE in the region, and who can provide them? And the final question is, what are some areas and mechanisms of civic sub-regional cooperation in adult learning and education? Some of which have come out clearly in the recommendations that we just discussed. So can we have this segment of our discussion before we conclude?
Thank you, Dr. Rodi. And I wonder, because we've had such an eloquent, strong synthesis, which is formed into recommendations from Angela, I wonder if I can just add in what I didn't hear, save repeating what we have heard, and also for the sake of time. And I just would also like to beg everybody's indulgence that if we could give 2 minutes over to Annalise Robertson to give a quick summary of the civil society recommendations, then I will take 4 minutes to synthesize what I didn't hear, which still gives you time to close, but also knowing that we have reports that have been submitted. So if that's all right with you, Dr. Rodi, I wonder if 2 minutes can go to the civil society voice right now. And I know that Annalise Robertson is ready.
I totally agree with you. So let's ask Annalise Robertson to take the floor.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Dr. Rodi. In summary, from the CSO recommendations, I just wanted to capture some of the main points that haven't already been mentioned. And rethinking education has been a very strong voice in the feedback from the CSOs, and particularly looking outside of Western academic development of education. So we have heard a lot from the synthesis about the inclusion of mother tongue, heritage tongue, Indigenous languages and culture through that. So the key recommendations for advancing ALE in the Pacific through policy is looking at urging governments to see the importance of lifelong learning as a way to equip people with resilience, not only literacy and numeracy, but looking at environmental literacy and digital literacy. Countries needing a system that acknowledge and recognise community and funds it, so the value proposition, but also to build disaggregated data to inform ALE policy. So very much some work around policy developments in those countries. Recommendation to, again, look at new technologies, how they are included in the ALE plan through access, but also looking at the impact on climate change realities, decrease civil society spaces, natural resources, human disruptions, the digital economy, and new forms of energy. Sorry, I'm just covering what we haven't already covered. It's quite a focus on traditional knowledge, intergenerational learning, and integrating them into community learning programs. The role of Pacific women should be ensured in all their diversity and are front and centre of the Pacific Regional ALE plan. Through financing and governance, that government and education policymakers must develop and implement comprehensive, robust and explicit policies promoting cultural and gender responsive ALE within a lifelong learning framework. So rethinking the notion of literacy and recognising the different literacies and knowledge systems in the Pacific. Addressing the finance gap between formal education and non-formal education. Developing multiple pathways to learning to provide continuing learning options for learners who have been pushed out of the formal education system. Recognising the importance of a partnership approach to advancing ALE. Need for consistent gender equality and women's empowerment principles across the globe, and how this may be mainstreamed across all areas of policy coherence. And recommending that the governing body and the processes for how they are nominated be reviewed. We are most dissatisfied that we do not have a Pacific representative on the UIL governing body for the largest region in the world.
Thank you, Annalise, and thank you for those statements and being aware that civil society groups have met. So if I can just fill in what I didn't hear, given the robustness and strength of the conversations we've had already. I think the first point is that adult education does matter in the Pacific, but we call it different things. And we know that the common discourse with UNESCO and with UIL is lifelong learning, and adult education is an integral part and stands on its own as well as contributes to a lifelong learning society. And when we were talking about linkages, ALE underpins so much of what we do in the Pacific, as I said earlier, using our own terms, and it will really, drawing on the Indigenous, must be embedded in Indigenous knowledge and must be seen to stand alongside and add to some of the solutions that we need to think of with many of the issues that the Pacific face. And I also just wanted to mention that mobility has continued throughout the Pacific. So now many peoples are moving between New Zealand and Australia, particularly in the temporary migrant programs. And we also have to think about how we work collaboratively across the region so that the skills that they gain, just not through what they're learning in the field on horticulture, but also what they're learning in literacy and numeracy and financial literacy, can be a way to offer a conduit to adult learning in the Pacific. So when we think about learning in the Pacific, it needs to be as mobile as its people now. So there's can be the influence of when a large proportion of the workforce of our Pacific countries come to New Zealand and Australia, that's absolutely integral to how we think, and that those receiving countries must be in the position to provide adult education for all of the people that move here from the Pacific for the short time. You know, since COVID, learning has taken second place in some communities. Some people just want to make a living through whatever ways, and sometimes learning isn't the priority. And so that's where we have to be innovative and find new ways to engage and get excited again about the learning, and just ensure that there is sustainable learning mechanisms that help people to recover, as was already said in the COVID recovery. And the last two is that, as Dr. Violetti said, in his earlier reporting framework that when he was looking for data from the Grail report from the Pacific countries, that we need to be more attentive if we want to strengthen our systems to have that data. SDG 4 monitoring mechanisms do insist in some cases on the data, and while we may have a story to tell where we can improve some of our data capture, that would help immensely, I think, in terms of strengthening our systems. And the last comment, Dr. Rhodey, is just to reassure us that we have the capacity ourselves, all of those present here, to take charge to our own collaborative efforts through not waiting for the next 6 or 12 years, but building our own capacity and strengths, using the resources of the ministries, the MFAT, the donors, to help build ourselves collectively to go forward in the next post-COVID chapter of our lives. And I think that if I was to capture everything that has been said, it would be to call on the wisdom of our ancestors and to rethink education that's based on our old cultural values to take us forward to be global citizens. So I think that's just to reinforce what I didn't hear and add into the wonderful enriching discussions that we've already had. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandra, for your synthesis, and particularly for highlighting, some of the things that we did not elaborate more on in detail, and you've done that so well. So I would like to thank you for that. I've been one of time management, so I'm going to give up just a roundup, and I'd like to summarize, our discussions on 2 key themes that I've sort of thought about, having listened to the discussions as well as the reports, and now this being concluded by the synthesis on what was discussed. So there are 2 themes that have come out for me, and these are expectations and aspirations for what we can do next. So I think where we know where exactly we are in terms of adult learning and education. There are so many expectations. Our people are expecting us to provide the opportunities, the learning opportunities, so that our adults as well as students can be able to achieve the educational outcomes that we want them to achieve. We're also expecting our governments to contribute or to invest in adult learning and education. We are also, there is also expectation amongst us, those of us who are driving various education reforms in our respective countries, the role that we play and what we must focus on, so that, at least we can make improvements in the area that we have discussed, as well as the areas that the civil society organizations have discussed and recommended. And finally, the aspirations, the potential that we have to progress where we want to go next. And it's good, listening to ours, various stories, that we have identified certain potentials that we have in terms of the improvement that we can make to improve access to technology in terms of internet, so that the information that is available can also be accessed by adults who need to find out more about what they are looking for. So yes, we have our own goals and our aspirations, and of course, there are challenges that will hinder us as we progress. But I'm so glad that we have talked about this in some detail, and appreciate, those key challenges like funding, as well as the inability to reach out to the unreached adults, especially in countries which are large and their logistic and transportation difficulties. So all in all, I'd like to thank you all for your contributions in the discussion. I have no doubt in my mind that we have discussed quite intensively, and I'm so glad that every one of you have contributed. So once again, thank you all for your contribution and a fruitful discussions that we had. In closing, I would first like to invite Mrs. Osu Wampong from UIL again for her remarks before I hand back the meeting to the chair, Dr. Combro. So, Ms. Osu Wampong, would you like to say your final remarks before we stop?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would just like to round up and thank everyone for their participation. Thank especially also UNESCO, thank the ministry representatives that we have come together for this sub-regional consultations. I have very much enjoyed the deliberations. Thank you very much for the very targeted and vital discussion. And we will definitely take all the deliberations, the conclusions, the synthesis with us to Morocco and make it available there for the overall discussion. So thank you very much. I try to be as short as possible again, and I hope that my warm thanks are being felt by everybody who has participated and also contributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, now I would like to hand the meeting back to the chair, Dr. Combro, for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Roddy. My heartfelt gratitude to all the presenters and participants for your valuable sharing, especially from the non-government organization, civil society, in the discussions we have had today. I'd like, on behalf of all of us, to thank Dr. Roddy for moderating this session. We have now come to the end of our rich discussions today, and I would at this juncture like to invite Ms. Angela from Germany, UIL, to provide our closing remarks for today's sessions. Angela.
Yes, I already had my closing remarks, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you anyway. Thank you for waking up so early to join us. We welcome your recommendations and comments you have made. We believe you will take them forward to the next stage and to Morocco. Thank you for your support to our region and PHES. We have learned some innovations and successful examples from inside and outside of the region. We have reviewed some common challenges and proposed some ways forward to align our policies, strategies, and programs. And many of the countries in the Pacific at the national level do not have close policy directives. And obviously, we also have expressed the challenges of resourcing. The success of moving this forward to each and every one of our in our countries is on our shoulders, that we need to work extra hard with our development partners and our governments to allow for our endeavors in ALE to move forward. We know the common challenges and recommendations that will come out in the final outcome document that we will be able to present tomorrow. As we come to the end of this session, I'd like to also, on behalf of the co-host UNESCO Institute, like to thank the Institute of Lifelong Learning and UNESCO Office for the Pacific States. I thank Dr. Violetti, Dr. Morrison, colleagues from civil society and universities for your support and technical input today. I extend my sincere appreciation to all the countries. Thank you for your active participation and cooperation. I'd like to now move on to inform also that the background resource paper and summary of the Pacific recommendations will be put together as a publication. And if you do have the opportunity to, I'd like to request that you follow the UIL and UNESCO Pacific Office websites for further developments and comments. For tomorrow's session, it will once again start at 10 a.m. And the first hour and a half will be a closed business meeting. And I ask the PHES members to peruse the agenda and also the background papers that were provided to us directly from the Secretariat so that we can progress the discussions and decisions quickly tomorrow morning. That's for tomorrow. At this time, I'd like to ask Nisha and Aya if they have any administrative announcements to make before I close.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you also, yes, Roddy, Franco, you did an excellent job of moderating the 3 different outcome groups, findings as well as their recommendations. I think for the Pacific, this is the first time in a long while, I think after 2011, that we are discussing adult learning and education. And it is, I think, an important reminder that in our rush to reach visible goals, sometimes we forget that the task of those who are not, on the mainland or in front of us, or those who are outside the radar of our contacts, where education is still lagging. That unless those populations are reached, the agenda of education for all cannot be fulfilled. It can't be met. And the second point, I think, which pertains to our work as the UNESCO Office for the Pacific States, is that we also need to critically examine our approaches and different interventions that we have. Do we need to do something specific for those groups of people who are not reached through our mainstream programming, whether it is the regular program or it is the projects and various other technical assistance initiatives that we have for the ministries of education. Oftentimes, we also see adult education belongs to ministries dealing with community development, social development. And as we heard from Fiji, sometimes these are completely sectoral interventions or areas where only civil society is active. So we do need to think, as we are considering the Pacific Regional Education Framework, that how do we ensure that when we are talking about the Pacific Regional Education Framework, and our friend Felipe is here with us, how do we make sure that it is inclusive, not only in terms of gender equality, of advocates who are visible, not only of persons with disabilities who are part of the associations and organizations, but also looking at those remote populations where these different categories of people exist. And aside from that, the larger population is not yet benefiting from the educational resources. So distribution of educational infrastructure, technical assistance, as well as the pedagogies that need to be customized and localized. And Sandra made references to this. Sandra, it was lovely to see you after almost a gap of 3 years. I wanted to, say a big hi to you earlier, but didn't have the opportunity. You were very busy. So very, very pleased to see you. And you are indeed our elder who reminded us of the importance of this important topic and agenda. And we will definitely take this on board, and we will work with our partners in the regional organizations, as well as with the body called IFONO that operates regionally, to see how do we take the issue forward. Thank you again, Gail, to you. Your passion for education, of course, brought you here back into this fora. Lovely to see you. And thank you, Chair, to your team for all the flexibility that you have shown in terms of dealing with technological challenges, changes in moderation, etc., as well as taking on the additional responsibilities that have come your way. So thank you very much, and a very good evening, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, UNESCO and Anisha, for your very valuable observations and comments and suggestions once again. Thank you for being with us and giving us that support. Until we meet again tomorrow at 10 o'clock, wish everyone from Papua New Guinea a good afternoon, good evening. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.